Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
This week on To the Contrary, what impact have women had on journalism in the United States?
What impact were they having on the field and what impact the field was having on them, which wasn't always terrific. The struggles have been so difficult and remain so difficult. It's about women doing the jobs men would envy at points where that was really not easy to achieve.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Women are now a major force in reporting the news, but that wasn't always the case. It took many women and countless years to get to this point. So, who were the trailblazers, and what have their contributions been to American journalism? This week's woman thought leader has a new book that chronicles these pioneering women and their journey to make sure women's voices were heard. Joining us today is Brooke Kroeger, a professor and author of Undaunted, How Women Changed American Journalism. Welcome to you, Professor.
Oh, thank you. And I'm just Brooke. Thank
Brooke,
you for
okay. Welcome to you, Brooke. So, first of all, you were on the leading edge of retirement, and a vice president from a big publishing company came to you and said, here's the book I want written and I want you to write it. So tell me about that.
Well, he didn't quite say that. He said he wanted to discuss the project, that he was keen to have such a project written. And my name had come up from, I guess, several camps. So I didn't know him. I had announced at NYU that I was going to retire in about 2 years at that point, and knowing that I had a sabbatical and it was all going to work out. And here comes this cold call email. I thought I would pass out. So it was very, very welcome. And then we had lunch. He had very, very specific ideas about how this book should be written for a trade audience. You know, there are books like this in the academic sphere, but, you know, that's a little bit different than a book that's meant for a general audience. And the reason this happened was that he went looking for one in connection with some work that he was doing. And he couldn't find one. I mean, I know of one. I have it here, actually. I'll show you. It's the last time this was done, 1936. It's called Ladies of the Press by Ishbel Ross, who was the consummate front page girl of the 20s and early 30s. And she does it very differently. She does it by genre and by region. And her idea is basically to do a celebration of women in the field up to that point, though she starts where I start in 1840 at the beginning of mass media. And it's a celebration of the Midwestern women and the New York women and the front page girls and the stunt girls and, you know, the sob sisters, every women's incarnation that comes along. And so my book is not like that. It's very different in concept. It's very chronological. It takes the field decade by decade by decade, looking at each decade distinctly to see what emerged in that period, who mattered, who rose to public attention when it wasn't normal for women to rise to public attention quite that way. And then from that, I could start to see, well, what was happening to women generally? You know, what was really going on and what impact were they having on the field and what impact the field was having on them, which wasn't always terrific.
So let's start from the beginning then. Tell me, in 1840, who was working? How did the first woman get into mass media?
So I'm really careful about the firsts because, you know, when you say first, somebody else is the first before that first. One of the things that drives me crazy personally is, you know, even recently, I mean, you can find it in the paper practically once a month. Someone dies after a wonderful career and they're described as a trailblazer or a pioneer, and they just aren't. Because every time I see that, I say, but there was Pauline Frederick. You're wrong. It just comes to me that way. And I think it denies the history when we do that. And I think it has to do with, I tried to get over myself on this because it irritates me so much, obviously, because I know too much. But I realize that the reason this happens for two reasons. One is nobody's done the history as a continuum where you really see the stretch of it. And so you're looking at your place in the pond, and someone's thrown a stone and the ripples come out and you say, oh, this is the whole universe. But really it's an ocean. So that's one thing that happens. The other is that I think the struggles have been so difficult and remain so difficult that you have the feeling that you're a pioneer. Because even though you're clearing underbrush and overgrowth, it feels like you're blazing the trail. So that's where I cut some slack.
Interesting. So you think women going into the field are still pioneers?
No, I'm saying that we'll notice that if you see obituaries, like just look in the papers. Yeah, everybody's a pioneer. They're not pioneers. The pioneers have happened long before. That's all I'm saying.
Right. Why did you pick the 40s? Because I think clearly there have been books written about some very famous female journalists. Nellie Bly comes to mind, or Ida B. Wells.
Right, but they're later. They're later, Bonnie. So I started in 1840 with Margaret Fuller.
Oh, you started? Okay, all right.
Who predates them by 50 years. So it goes back further. And 1840 is kind of an accepted date for the start of mass media. This is when Horace Greeley, develops the New York Tribune. I mean, this is where all the penny press happens. I mean, it's an important period in the development of the news industry.
The 1840s, the women did not have. I mean, there certainly wasn't the constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote for much.
There was not until 1920. And in 1840, we didn't even have Seneca Falls till 1848. So we're talking about a very early point where feminism was having its early, buds. The buds were happening. Women were starting to talk about it. Margaret Fuller's treatise is considered very important on this subject and a founding feminist document. Her story is fabulous, though she dies very young and tragically. I say it's, a German fairy tale for grown-ups. I mean, it's a really sad story, but she has a fantastic career up to the point that she is no longer with us. And other women at that time just did remarkable things to get into the field and not to be writing about, flower shows and society gossip. And there really were women who triumphed. The conceit of the book, though my editor didn't love me saying this, but really is the conceit of the book, that it's about women doing men's jobs. It's about women doing the jobs men would envy at points where that was really not easy to achieve. And then when it got easier too, of course.
So tell me, and tell the audience, more importantly, where the book starts and why you mentioned that you picked the 1840s because it was the beginning of mass media.
Exactly, and Margaret Fuller, who is just a remarkable character. And all the things we think about women who got to achieve early, that they were beautiful or had great personalities or, other things that helped them along the way. None of this is true of Margaret Fuller. She was homely by her own description. She was off-putting in her style, irritating, but she had a remarkable gift of discourse, and had been allowed to be trained, have her mind trained by her father, who taught her the classics, who taught her German literature, who taught her everything. He really tutored her. Whereas most women at that time, even if they were educated, were going to charm school. I mean, that's what happened. So people saw them as having a real defect when it came to training their minds, their ability to catalog knowledge. So Margaret Fuller took it on herself in Boston to start something she called the Conversations. She's very involved with the transcendental community. And these conversations are enormously popular because she has an extraordinary gift of gab. And so that happens. In the meantime, she's a master networker. Like most of the women I talk about, they are master networkers from the beginning. She wants to know the greatest mind of the century, who she thinks is Ralph Waldo Emerson, and she makes it her business to befriend him. She's invited to his home, finally, by the wife, spends 2 weeks with them in Concord, and he comes around to liking her, which he was not predisposed to do. He found her off-putting. He didn't like her quirks. She bats her eyes all the time. I mean, she does things that are really annoying. So that happens. She does the conversations, and Greeley's wife is enthralled with her, absolutely enthralled. And they are coming to Boston all the time. And Greeley's wife, Mary, wants to become close to Margaret Fuller. So she convinces her husband to hire her as the literary editor of the Tribune, meaning she writes a column right next to Greeley's on the front page, signing it with an asterisk, as she does. And what else happens? Mary invites her to live in the Greeley household. So imagine the ingratiation that has taken place. After a short time, she's writing about literature and Goethe and things that she cares about. She decides that she really needs to investigate the underclass in New York. So she becomes a Metro reporter. She's really doing, really what we would call serious Metro work, city kind of news work. Does that for a couple of years, in addition to her literary stuff. And then she decides she'd like to go to Europe and, cover the Italian Revolution, which she does. And so her story is like that. I mean, I think of it as her having done everything any journalist would love to have had to be able to call a career, especially if you die at 40. I mean, remarkable. And then, that's a pretty great story. Alongside her is a woman 8 years older named Lydia Maria Child. There's a recent biography of her, another very interesting woman, also from Boston. And she and Fuller were friends, even though they were 8 years apart from the time Fuller was a teenager, because they shared interests in, studying John Locke. I mean, these are really intellectuals. And she spends her life, most of it, for 2 decades, writing about the frugal housewife, how girls should behave. I mean, she's doing things like that, plus biographies of women, women's interest work. And then she makes this giant turn to abolition and writes a treatise on how African Americans should be treated, including, ending the prohibition against miscegenation. I mean, she makes some radical stands for the time, which destroys her career for a decade. I mean, she becomes shunned. No one will talk to her. But that ingratiates her to the abolition movement, where she rebuilds her career. That gives the idea to the next generation, the people of the 1860s and 1870s. They start in the abolition press and find their way. Why? Because the abolition press isn't going to be able to afford the alpha males, the white alpha males. They are going to be more open to other people, a more diverse collection of people who can write about this topic or other topics. Well, the good thing about that for women was, A, they had platform because they were willing to write for pennies, and B, everybody read the abolition press. So from there, you see Gail Hamilton and Grace Greenwood move to the New York Times and the Atlantic right afterwards and build phenomenal careers at very high pay, as does Mary Clemmer.
Covering what?
Covering whatever they cover. A lot of them, they mostly do travel writing, essays, but and politics, Washington politics, plenty of that.
So right leading up to and then after the Civil War.
Correct. And Mary Clemmer, who is a minister's wife, quite unhappily married, is in the Maryland Heights of Virginia and covers the battle out her kitchen window. And it's interesting that the story, of course, isn't cabled real time like the regular reporters. It's mailed into the New York Post. It runs 2 weeks later, but zillions of papers across the country pick it up. It's really a fantastic battle story because she sees the whole thing out the window. And of course, it's called As a Woman Saw It, which becomes a tagline that sticks around for about 60, 70 years.
Tell me, since you read her work, how did her work differ stylistically from the men who were covering the Civil War at the time?
Well, her piece, is only different at the end where she says, I ran to the basement, being a coward. I mean, she does say that. But
Mhm.
if you hear her description of the battle, it's pretty good. The other thing you find not long after, around the 1890s, when there's, the war in Cuba and the Philippines and Greece, it becomes common for men correspondents to take their wives with them to war. And the wives basically become aides de camp. They can, trot copy off to the cable head, but they become very good at interviewing generals and getting information to spill out. And James Creelman, who was an exemplary war correspondent of that period, tells in one of his memoirs how these wives were in the foxholes and ready to jump into battle. And, of course, they're unnamed, but that was happening very early. Women willing to and doing that kind of work at a serious level. And then there are others who go on their own and are violent.
Were any of them killed?
Not in that period. I don't know of any deaths in that period. Of course, later we have deaths in Vietnam and elsewhere. We do have deaths and terrible injuries, even in the Spanish Civil War.
I remember covering the debate back during the post-Reagan years or the Reagan years about women in the military and women taking combat jobs. And one of the reasons conservatives cited against allowing women into combat positions was that the public wouldn't be able to take it when women died or were gravely wounded in war.
Oh, interesting. I haven't heard that one. For the reporters, the issues that were brought up, especially during World War II, when this got more organized, was that they would distract the men, that men, soldiers, that men would feel the need to protect them, which would distract them from what their primary goals, things like that. None of which were true for the women who actually did it. And many had to defy regulations to do it because it was against regulations for women to go to the front. They weren't supposed to go any further forward than where the WACs or the nurses went, which was way behind battle lines. Nonetheless, numerous did. Some of them were wire correspondents, which were sent to report. So, they did their job, even though it was against regulations. They faced house arrest, court martial, loss of credentials, like Martha Gellhorn did. For doing what they simply intended to do. So a blind eye pass was given to some women, though very quietly, because the mass of women who went in World War II really weren't equipped to cover battles. A lot of them were feature writers who had not come from the city desk, because every paper at that time basically had one city room or two, metro reporters who were women. The mass were feature writers, which is the normal place where women came up in the field or on the women's pages, and really were sent to cover those soft aspects of the war. The interesting thing about that, I think, is that it really developed another whole genre of war reporting or conflict reporting that we now value very much. I think maybe as much as we do the bang bang, really.
Yeah, so you're talking about features generally?
Shortages, how the soldiers are coping, what their meal fare is. The sorts of things they were sent to cover, because you figured that what the U.S. propaganda machine figured was every young man or officer had at least 4 women at home very concerned about what was happening to him. His mother, his wife, his sister, and his lover. Everybody was concerned. So that became an important aspect of coverage. And a lot of the work that women did is the work men did not want to do. So it was like that. Women's pages were lucrative. That's department store advertising. That's perfume advertising. That's big advertising. So the problem with women's pages, in general, if you're the editor, is you've got to have somebody to write that stuff. And the men did not want to do it. So that created place for the women. Often that meant, in their mind, that they might use that as a way to segue out of that bastion. And of course, that was rarely possible.
I do remember there was a cook in the Persian Gulf War named Shoshana Johnson who got a lot of publicity because, first of all, she was African American. She was on the front lines, and I think she was wounded. It's been a while, so
yeah, but not a journalist, so she wouldn't have been on my
no. But what we're talking about, like women couldn't do the bang bang and couldn't do the front lines. An
But
example
they
of
did it.
that, a lot of
But
women getting into that because the men didn't want to do it.
but they did go to battle. The top did. What I found that I think is a through there's several through lines. One is race and gender, which just travels through the entire book and really, so I don't know why it was surprising to me, but it was surprising in one way. I wouldn't have expected it to be such a through line, but it is. That's one thing. And then I don't know. It's there's just a lot of things like that that came through in a way that I hadn't expected.
But how real, that's a very interesting thing that you say, because how could you write a woman about a book about women trailblazers and not sort of to expect gender and even race to be major issues?
No, I didn't mean that they were issues. I meant that they intersected in really interesting ways. We see it in this early period around the 1850s where women will use, or will, I don't want to say use, but find a way into journalism through writing for the abolition press, where they find place. And then, of course, from that, they get seen by the bigger venues and then get real position. This is not a lot of women. These are the A+++ women. That's who gets opportunity. I want to be very clear about that. We're not talking about masses. We're talking about the select few. Then later on, you'll see things like Charlene Hunter Galt, who gets a job at the New York Times after the New Yorker and after a Washington local investigative TV job she has for a while. And at the Times, there's an episode where she goes to Chicago to cover a group of Black women in an important meeting. She dictates her story over the phone, as one did in the late 60s. 12 different editors look at it. And at some point along the line, everywhere she has written Black has been changed to Negro. And by the time she gets back to New York, it's already in print. She throws a flaming fit and writes a memo back to all 12 editors explaining why this is not okay. And the Times changes its policy. So, we see things like that happen all along the route. And then, of course, now we see it also in the 1619 Project and other things that have happened of a profound nature. So, there's that. Women invented the interview. I mean, this is not about gender and race, but it's things that women pioneered in many ways. They turned out to be very good at the interview. They aren't the only ones who did it, but they were exceptional at it. And that's a very established form we now, of course, honor and admire. We talked already about at war, how women were covering the more humanity-prone aspects of war. And that's become, I think, as we said, as important as the battle reports or the politics. What's happening, on the ground to everyday people in the course of this, and other ways that work has become as important. So these are all things that women have a real stake in. Most recently, we're moving away from gender and race, but not really. We found that at 3 nonprofits that I talk about at the end of the book, the 19th, the Marshall Project, and the Kaiser Foundation, all of these are run by women, and all of them have exceptional employee benefits packages that go way beyond where the industry is. So that's another form of pioneering and taking care of the people who do the work. So I just found, over and over again, these moments where what women were doing and the way they were doing it, sometimes because they were forced to, because other opportunities weren't available, but something, very rich has come out of that. Also some lousy stuff, like Sob Sisters. I mean, there's some bad stuff too, but generally pretty good.
And to close, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but you said there's still change to come.
Well, I don't know what I see coming. I worry that so many women are in charge now, because that's usually a sign of things falling apart. That's another through line of the book, that when a company is in trouble, suddenly the woman is the city editor, or she's the executive editor. So somebody had a picture the other day of all the women in broadcast who were in charge of so many networks. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is scary. So there's that. But there's also the online abuse of women, which is just so extreme right now. So there still are really battles to address. Like, why is that? Why sexualized, atrocious attacking, for work people are doing that, men also do? Why in that way? Men also get attacked. I don't mean to say they don't, but not with the same viciousness, not with the same hideousness, not the same.
And of course, the Me Too movement is certainly far from having completed its job. And
Well, but we'd have to say that what happened has held. I mean, those men have not found their way back into grace. They have not. So there is, a residual effect, and I think it's kind of difficult now to take the posture that many men very comfortably took for a very, very long time. I think that would be hard to do right now.
thank you so much for all of the enlightenment you shared with us.
My pleasure.
That's it for this edition. Keep the conversation going on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.